Sunday afternoon, the 2nd of April, 1916. Uplea's Marshes, on the tidal edge of Faversham, Kent, England. The weather has finally turned dry and warm after weeks of rain, the kind of bright, still afternoon that, in any other line of work, would be considered good news. Inside a low wooden storehouse at the Explosives Loading Company site sit roughly 200 tons of trinitrotoluene, along with stocks of ammonium nitrate, all of it waiting to be packed and shipped off to the artillery batteries of the Western Front. At 2:20, a stack of empty sacks catches fire. Within minutes, the fire reaches the stored explosive. What follows is not one single explosion, but a chain of them, one building detonating and setting off the next, the shock wave strong enough to be felt for miles along the Kent coast and rattle windows well beyond the county. Because it's a Sunday, the workers who normally staff the daily shift are mostly at home. This is, in a bitter kind of way, the one detail that keeps the death toll from being far higher. Among those who are on site, though, is the entire Works Fire Brigade. Every single one of them dies fighting the blaze they were trying to put out. By evening, 115 workers are confirmed dead. A week later, 108 coffins go into a single mass grave at Faversham Cemetery, buried together in one collective act of mourning a small town was never prepared for. 7 of the dead are never found at all. There is simply nothing left to bury. It is, to this day, officially recorded as the worst disaster in the entire history of the British explosives industry. And yet almost nobody outside Kent has ever heard of it. Here's the strange part. Uplea's was not some new, hastily bolted-together wartime factory. It stood on ground that had been making explosive powder for nearly 400 years, since long before muskets had bayonets, since before England had a standing navy worth the name. This particular stretch of Kentish marsh had survived plagues, revolutions, and the reigns of 9 monarchs without a single disaster on this scale. So what changed? And why, out of the hundreds of gunpowder works that once dotted the English and American countryside, most of them running for a century or more without anyone outside the parish ever hearing their name, did this particular piece of industrial history get erased from public memory almost entirely? To answer that, we have to go back to the very beginning of an industry that ran, quite literally, on the edge of its own destruction, and that quietly buried hundreds of its workers along the way, just to keep the world supplied with gunpowder. The obvious question after a scene like that is simple. What exactly went wrong on that particular Sunday? Was it sabotage? Was it plain negligence? Historians still disagree because the official cause of the fire was never conclusively established. Some accounts point to a dropped match or cigarette, others to friction from dragging crates across a wooden floor, and at least one report claims a much larger quantity of unexploded material sat in nearby sheds and simply never went up. That question, honestly, doesn't explain very much. Fires start. Accidents happen. Naming the specific spark doesn't tell us why an entire industry was built in a way that made a spark so catastrophic in the first place. A more useful question is a different one. Why did an entire branch of industrial engineering exist whose central, unsolvable problem was that its own product could kill the people making it, with no fully reliable way to prevent that? For roughly 400 years, across England, France, Germany, and eventually the United States, thousands of skilled workers went to their jobs each day in buildings deliberately designed to blow apart if something went wrong, because a small, contained explosion in one shed was treated as the acceptable price of avoiding a catastrophic one across the whole site. That single design philosophy, expect the failure and simply try to control its size, shows up again and again throughout this story, in different countries, in different centuries, built by people who had never heard of each other. That is not a footnote to history. That is the entire discipline of gunpowder milling, condensed into one sentence, and almost nobody remembers it, because gunpowder mills didn't leave behind railways, bridges, or skylines the way other industrial revolutions did. What they left behind instead are grassy fields, quiet nature reserves, and a handful of stone ruins that look, to a casual visitor, like the remains of some picturesque old flour mill, rather than sites where hundreds of people lost their lives. So this isn't really a story about one explosion in 1916. It's a story about how an entire industry learned, slowly, expensively, and at a cost measured directly in human lives, to manufacture something that, by its very chemical nature, resisted being manufactured safely at all. Every technique that follows in this video, every clever piece of engineering, exists because somebody died finding out that the old method didn't work. By the end of this account, it will be clear exactly why the Upleys disaster was almost inevitable, and why it happened near the end, rather than the beginning, of gunpowder's 400-year run as the most important explosive on Earth. Zoom out for a second, because the story just told is not an isolated tragedy. It's the visible tip of an enormous, largely invisible industry. Gunpowder itself is nearly 1,000 years old, first developed in China and carried west along trade routes and through the Islamic world until it reached Europe by around the 1300s. But knowing the recipe, a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, was never the hard part. The hard part was manufacturing it in large enough quantities, at a consistent enough quality, to arm an army or blast open a mine without the whole operation periodically annihilating itself. That manufacturing problem created an entire category of specialized industrial site, the gunpowder mill. In England alone, heritage surveys have identified around 60 separate gunpowder production sites that once operated across the country, concentrated for very practical reasons, near the Thames estuary to supply London and the Royal Navy, in Cumbria and the southwest near the mining industry that needed blasting powder, and along the coast wherever ships could bring in sulfur from as far away as Sicily and haul finished powder straight out to the fleet. The pattern repeats across every country that fought a major war in the age of gunpowder. France had its Royal Powder Works. The newly independent United States, desperate not to depend on European suppliers after its own revolution, built an entire industry from scratch on the Brandywine Creek in Delaware, a site we'll return to later, because what happened there is almost unbelievable in scale. And scale is really the point here. A single successful gunpowder works didn't run for a decade or two and quietly close. Faversham's mills operated for roughly 370 years. The Royal Gunpowder Mills at Waltham Abbey ran continuously, in one form or another, for over 300 years. The Eleutherian mills on the Brandywine operated under DuPont family control for 117 years by the company's own historical accounting. These weren't brief industrial experiments. They were multi-generational institutions, employing entire towns, where fathers and then their sons went to work in buildings that everyone on site knew could kill them without warning. That's the scale involved here. Not one dramatic accident, but hundreds of mills, running for centuries, manufacturing something the whole world needed and almost nobody wanted to make. Now here's how it actually worked, starting with the oldest surviving gunpowder mill left on Earth. To understand any of this, start at the place that still stands today as the oldest surviving gunpowder mill anywhere in the world. Chart Mills, on the edge of Faversham, Kent. Gunpowder production here goes back to around the year 1560, when a water mill on the edge of town, situated on a stream that could be dammed at intervals for power, was converted for the purpose. The location wasn't chosen by accident. The low, marshy ground nearby was ideal for growing alder and willow, the preferred sources of charcoal, one of gunpowder's 3 core ingredients. The stream fed into a tidal creek that could bring in sulfur shipped from as far away as Sicily and saltpeter imported from India, then carry the finished powder straight out toward London and the Royal Navy's magazines along the Thames. For roughly 2 centuries, this and similar mills across England were run by private contractors, with predictably uneven results. Quality varied wildly from batch to batch, which is a serious problem when the product in question is meant to reliably fire a cannon or hold open a mine face. In 1759, the government decided it had had enough of unreliable private supply and simply nationalized the home works at Faversham outright, upgrading the machinery in the process. It's from this phase that today's surviving chart mill dates. The core engineering problem being solved here was called incorporation. How do you take three separate powdered chemicals, saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, and blend them into a single, evenly mixed, dampened cake, without simply grinding them together dry and risking ignition from friction? The solution was the incorporating mill, a pair of water wheels driving four separate mills, each using heavy edge-runner stones rolling in a circular bed to slowly crush and blend the dampened ingredients together. Historical records describe the full process as 11 distinct stages, each one dangerous in a slightly different way, from refining the raw saltpeter through incorporation, pressing, and final glazing of the finished grains. It was, for its era, a genuinely sophisticated piece of chemical engineering, centuries before anyone had a word for chemical engineering. And it worked well enough that Faversham became one of the most important production centers in the entire country, supplying an industry that Britain's Navy and Army depended on completely. None of that sophistication made the work safe. Even with improved machinery, incorporation remained a process where a single spark, a piece of grit caught between the millstone and its bed, or simple metal-on-stone friction, could set off a blast strong enough to take off a roof. Because of that risk, the people running Faversham's mills made a deliberate choice: keep individual batches small. A catastrophic single explosion was less likely if each mill only processed a modest quantity of powder at a time. It was a safety strategy built entirely around acceptance, the assumption that explosions would happen, so the goal became making sure each one stayed small. That assumption didn't always hold. As the works expanded into high explosives production from 1847 onward, the risks grew with it, and local residents complained regularly about roofs damaged by blasts from a factory that, remarkably, was allowed to operate essentially inside a residential area. Local families lived a short walk from a working gunpowder mill for their entire lives, and treated the occasional explosion almost the way other communities treated bad weather. And yet the results mattered enormously, at the highest level of national history. Powder very likely milled at Chart helped fire the guns at Trafalgar in 1805 and at Waterloo a decade later, two of the most consequential battles in British history, made possible in part by workers whose names were, for the most part, never recorded anywhere. That's the contrast worth sitting with: enormous historical consequence, produced by people who left almost no trace in the record at all. The mill outlived them by centuries. Faversham's explosives industry as a whole ran until 1934, when the site's owners, fearing the factory would become a target in a future war with Germany, shifted production to Scotland and shut the Kent works down for good. And this exists today too. Chart Gunpowder Mill was very nearly demolished in the 1960s, before the Faversham Society rescued it, restored the machinery, and reopened it to the public in 1969. It's still there now, the oldest gunpowder mill on the planet, sitting quietly in an English town best known today for its beer, its wheel and millstones intact, waiting for visitors who mostly have no idea what they're looking at. But Faversham was just the beginning. The next chapter in this story belongs to a much larger, state-run operation, one that would turn gunpowder manufacture from a local trade into something closer to a national science. Move now from a quiet corner of Kent to the banks of the River Lee in Essex, and to a very different kind of solution to the same underlying problem. Gunpowder production at Waltham Abbey traces back to the 1640s, when a watermill previously used to press vegetable oil was converted for powder making during a shortage caused by the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In 1665, Ralph Hudson signed the site's first recorded ordnance contract with the government. By 1735, a local historian was already describing it as, in his words, the largest and most complete works in Great Britain. High praise for what was still, at that point, a private family business run by the Waltons. The problem Britain faced by the middle of the 18th century was straightforward. Private contractors, however skilled, were an unreliable foundation for something as strategically important as gunpowder supply during wartime. Quality fluctuated, prices fluctuated, and a nation fighting increasingly large-scale wars couldn't afford either. The solution came from a single, determined military officer. Major William Congreve, Deputy Comptroller of the Royal Laboratory at Woolwich, spent years pushing the government to simply buy the Waltham Abbey works outright. In October of 1787, the Crown finally did, paying £10,000 to the Walton family and beginning what would become a 204-year period of government ownership. What Congreve did next was, in its own quiet way, revolutionary. He treated gunpowder manufacture not as a trade secret passed down through families, but as a subject for the scientific method, the kind of careful measurement, testing, and process control that wouldn't become standard across British industry for another century. Buildings were deliberately spaced apart across the site so that an explosion in one wouldn't set off its neighbors. Blast wall traverses were built to direct any explosion's force away from occupied areas. An extensive canal network moved raw and finished material between processing stages, letting workers avoid the friction and impact risks of overland cartage. Congreve himself, in surviving correspondence from 1801, worried openly that even these traverse walls might not be strong enough to stop one explosion from destroying the buildings around it, a level of engineering anxiety most manufacturers of the era simply didn't bother with. It worked. Under Crown ownership, Waltham Abbey didn't just survive, it became the technical benchmark the rest of the British gunpowder industry was measured against. None of that engineering made gunpowder manufacture safe in any absolute sense. It only made catastrophic failure somewhat less likely. Waltham Abbey's own archives record recurring explosions across its history, including a notable series in 1940. The site's design philosophy of spacing, traverses, and canal transport was, in effect, a constant admission that individual accidents were expected and simply had to be contained rather than eliminated. What is clear is that this design worked well enough, over 3 centuries, to prevent anything approaching the scale of catastrophes seen elsewhere in the industry, which is itself a kind of achievement, purchased through careful, deliberate over-engineering rather than luck. The results, when they came, were genuinely remarkable. In 1809, powder from 6 of the country's leading gunpowder mills was tested head-to-head in a firing competition on Marlborough Downs. Waltham Abbey's powder sent its cannonball further than any of its rivals, a direct, measurable validation of Congreve's scientific approach to a trade that had, for centuries, operated on little more than inherited habit. The site's importance only grew from there. By the First World War, staff numbers had swelled to over 6,200, roughly 3,000 of them women recruited from the surrounding area, a significant social shift for the time, and one of the larger civilian mobilizations of female industrial labor in the country. And in 1889, Waltham Abbey produced something that would ultimately help end the black powder era altogether: cordite, a smokeless propellant patented by chemists Frederick Abel and James Dewar, working right there on site. The mill that had perfected the old technology also helped invent the one that replaced it. Waltham Abbey's gunpowder and explosives production finally ended in July of 1945, but the site itself didn't close. It simply changed purpose, continuing as a government explosives research establishment until 1991. Since 1999, it has been open to the public as a heritage site. 175 acres of parkland, 21 historic listed buildings, a demonstration narrow-gauge railway, and miles of the same canal network Congreve once used to keep his workers a little safer than the industry standard. 2 very different solutions, then, to the same problem. Faversham's small batch caution, and Waltham Abbey's engineered, state-funded rigor. Neither one solved the underlying danger completely. Across the Atlantic, a third approach was about to push the entire industry toward a scale nobody in England had yet attempted. By the turn of the 19th century, the newly independent United States faced its own version of Britain's old problem, with an added complication. There was no domestic industry to nationalize in the first place. American forces had spent the Revolutionary War dependent on gunpowder imported from France and elsewhere, an arrangement no young nation fighting for its survival wanted to rely on twice. The man who solved it was Eleuthère Irénée Dupont, a French chemist and refugee from the French Revolution. In 1802, he bought 95 acres on the Brandywine Creek near Wilmington, Delaware, from a local landowner named Jacob Broom, paying $6,740 for land that already included a working dam and mill race. Crucially, DuPont didn't have to invent gunpowder machinery from scratch. He imported it directly from France, along with site plans supplied by the French government itself, essentially transplanting European manufacturing know-how onto American soil. The engineering solution he built is worth pausing on. Each individual mill building along the Brandywine was constructed with heavy stone walls on 3 sides, but only a light wooden wall on the 4th side, the side facing the creek. If a mill exploded, the design was meant to blow that explosion outward toward the water, rather than sideways into the next building in the row. It was the same underlying philosophy as Waltham Abbey's spaced-out traverse walls, arrived at independently, on a different continent, by people solving the identical problem from scratch. It worked commercially almost immediately. By the end of 1804, DuPont had sold 39,000 pounds of powder. The following year, sales tripled. The federal government became a steady customer, along with John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company. In 1813, the company purchased the neighboring Hagley property downstream, doubling its production capacity outright. By 1834, the mills produced 1 million pounds of powder in a single year for the first time, and during the Civil War, the company would go on to supply 4 million barrels of powder to the federal government. Eleutherian Mills had become, without much competition, the largest black powder manufacturer in the United States. Scale like that came at a cost that has to be stated plainly. Between 1802 and 1921, the Eleutherian Mills experienced 288 separate explosions, which together killed 228 people. That is not one catastrophic event. It is nearly a century and a fifth of a working population living with the near certainty that, sooner or later, an explosion would take someone they knew. Some of those explosions have names attached to them, remembered specifically because of who died. The 1818 disaster, still called the Great Explosion in company records, killed 34 workers and was reportedly felt 40 miles away. It seriously injured DuPont's own wife. In 1857, a series of accidental fires and blasts killed company partner Alexis Irénée Dupont himself, along with 6 others, a reminder that even the family that owned the business wasn't exempt from the risk they were asking their workforce to accept every day. An 1890 explosion in the upper yard killed 12 and caused damage felt as far away as Philadelphia. And in November of 1915, an explosion in the packing house killed 30 more, the deadliest single event at the site since 1818. Here is the number comparison worth sitting with. DuPont's own recorded workplace injury frequency rate, major injuries per million hours worked, stood at 43.2 in 1912. By 1927, 6 years after the powder yards finally closed, that figure had fallen to 3.4. It took over a century of explosions and the deaths of hundreds of workers to drive home lessons that could have, in principle, been learned from a single, well-documented accident. The mills closed permanently as a business in 1921, undone not by another explosion, but by a rival technology we'll get to shortly. And this exists today, too. In 1952, DuPont family members donated 185 acres of the site, along with a $6 million endowment, to found a museum of industrial history. The Hagley Museum and Library opened in 1957, and the site became a National Historic Landmark in 1966. Visitors today can walk the same creekside path where 228 people once lost their lives, making the gunpowder that helped build a nation. Return now to the scene from the very beginning of this story, because we've been building toward it the entire time, and it's the point where everything we've just covered collides at once. By 1916, the First World War had turned artillery into the dominant weapon on the Western Front, and every army involved needed shells in quantities nobody had planned for. Trinitrotoluene, TNT, had become the preferred military high explosive, more stable to handle than the nitroglycerin-based explosives that came before it, and powerful enough to make old-fashioned black powder look almost quaint by comparison. But TNT alone couldn't be produced fast enough to meet wartime demand, so manufacturers began stretching it by blending it with ammonium nitrate into a compound explosive called amytal, getting more finished shell filling out of every scarce ton of TNT. Faversham, already the site of nearly 350 years of explosives manufacturing experience by this point, was a natural place to put a new high explosives loading factory. The Upleas marshes, on the same tidal creek system that had once floated sulfur and saltpeter in for the old incorporating mills, now hosted the Explosives Loading Company's works, a facility built not to slowly incorporate black powder cake, but to pack raw industrial quantities of TNT and ammonium nitrate into shell casings destined for the front. This was, in other words, a fundamentally different scale of risk than anything the homeworks or chart mills had ever handled. Black powder, for all its danger, ignites and burns quickly rather than detonating with the same devastating force as a modern high explosive. 200 tons of TNT is not 200 tons of gunpowder. It is a difference in kind, not just degree. And the people running Upleas in the spring of 1916 were operating at the very edge of what the era's explosives handling knowledge could safely manage. By evening on that Sunday in April, the toll was clear. 115 workers dead, including every member of the Upleas Works Fire Brigade, killed trying to control a fire that had already outrun anything firefighting technique of the era could contain. Because it was a Sunday, the ordinarily large workforce that staffed British explosives factories during the war was almost entirely absent, a detail that likely kept the death toll from being significantly higher, even as it meant the workers who happened to be on site that day had almost no support. A week later, 108 coffins were buried together in a single mass grave at Faversham Cemetery, a scale of collective loss the small town had never experienced, even across 3.5 centuries of explosives manufacturing on its doorstep. 7 of the dead were never recovered at all. Here's the number comparison that makes the scale land. DuPont's worst single event, the Great Explosion of 1818, killed 34 people in one of the deadliest days across that company's entire 117-year history. Upleas killed more than 3 times that number in a single afternoon. It remains, officially, the worst disaster in the history of the British explosives industry, worse than anything Faversham's own 4 centuries of small-batch, deliberately cautious gunpowder milling had ever produced. That's the bitter irony sitting underneath this entire case. The very same stretch of Kent marshland that had spent 350 years perfecting the art of keeping individual explosions small, spacing mills apart, limiting batch sizes, accepting frequent minor accidents to avoid one catastrophic one, hosted, within living memory of its oldest workers, the single deadliest explosion in the country's history. Wartime demand for scale had simply overwhelmed a safety philosophy built for a much smaller, slower industry. And this exists today, too, in its own quiet way. The Upleas site is now part of Orr Marshes, a nature reserve and country park open to the public, with a memorial marking where the works once stood. Visitors walk across ground that, just over a century ago, buried more than 100 people in a single week. Most of their names known today only to their families, and to whichever local historian later took the trouble to write them down. Every case in this story, from Faversham to Waltham Abbey to the Brandywine, was ultimately built around the same three ingredients: saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, combined and refined through increasingly sophisticated versions of the same basic incorporating mill process. That entire approach was already being replaced even as some of these mills were still running at full capacity. The shift started in 1867 when Alfred Nobel patented dynamite, a way of stabilizing the previously unpredictable explosive nitroglycerin using an absorbent material, making it dramatically safer to transport and handle than anything a black powder mill produced. Guncotton followed, another nitro-based explosive with far greater blasting power than gunpowder, patented in 1865. Then in 1889 came cordite, invented, as we've already seen, at Waltham Abbey itself by Frederick Abel and James Dewar, a smokeless propellant that outperformed black powder in nearly every military application. By the First World War, TNT and amytal had taken over as the dominant explosives for artillery shells entirely, which is exactly what turned Faversham's historic gunpowder marshes into the high explosives loading factory that exploded at Upley's. The consequences for the old black powder industry were swift and largely one-directional. Smokeless powders didn't just perform better, they burned cleaner, gave weapons greater range and accuracy, and were generally safer to manufacture once the initial chemistry was mastered. Military demand for old-fashioned black powder collapsed first, followed gradually by industrial demand from mining and quarrying. DuPont's Eleutherian mills, unable to compete against smokeless powder and its own newer product lines, closed permanently in 1921. Faversham's three remaining gunpowder and explosives factories shut down in 1934, when their owner, fearing that renewed war with Germany would put a coastal explosives works directly in the line of attack, relocated production and key staff to Ardere in Scotland. British black powder manufacture as a whole didn't fully end until 1976. Remarkably, a full century after Nobel's dynamite patent, black powder was still being made somewhere in the country, largely for niche uses like fireworks and historical firearms. It's a strange kind of ending for an industry built on centuries of hard-won engineering wisdom. Not a single dramatic failure, but a slow, market-driven displacement by chemistry that simply did the same job better. So what happened to the people, places, and companies at the center of this story? DuPont didn't disappear when its gunpowder mills closed. It transformed. The very land along the Brandywine where 228 people died making explosive powder became, decades later, the site of the DuPont Experimental Station, where researchers went on to invent nylon, Kevlar, Tyvek, Corian, and Nomex, materials that now show up in everything from bulletproof vests to kitchen countertops. In 1952, DuPont family members donated the historic mill land itself, along with a $6 million endowment, to establish what became the Hagley Museum and Library, opened in 1957 and declared a National Historic Landmark in 1966. In Faversham, Chart Gunpowder Mill came within a hair of demolition in the early 1960s before the Faversham Society intervened, restoring both the building and its original milling machinery and reopening it to visitors in 1969. It remains, to this day, the oldest surviving gunpowder mill anywhere on Earth. Nearby, the Ore Works site, once part of the same historic explosives industry, is now a country park, its process buildings conserved and its trails open to the public year-round, funded in part by a heritage lottery grant in the early 2000s. At Waltham Abbey, the transition was slower but no less complete. The site continued as a government explosives and rocket propellant research establishment for decades after gunpowder production ended, working on projects that eventually extended into early British rocket motor development. It finally closed as a research site in 1991, and after a period of decontamination and restoration, reopened to the public in 1999 as a heritage attraction spread across 175 acres. Three very different endings, then, for three sites that spent centuries solving versions of the same deadly problem. One became a chemical research powerhouse, one became a small-town heritage museum saved from the bulldozer at the last possible moment, and one spent another half-century in secret government service before finally opening its gates. All three, remarkably, can still be visited today by anyone curious enough to go looking. Here's the thing worth carrying away from all of this. Somewhere near where you live, in a quarry face, a railway cutting, a canal lock, a mine shaft, or the foundations of a road tunnel, there's a very good chance that black powder, made by workers whose names were rarely written down, did the actual blasting. For roughly 400 years before dynamite and TNT took over, gunpowder wasn't just a weapon of war, it was the tool that physically carved out the modern industrial world, one carefully measured, catastrophically risky charge at a time. Next time you drive through a rock cutting on a motorway, or walk along a canal towpath, or stand at the edge of an old quarry, it's worth remembering that somebody, somewhere, spent their working life inside a building deliberately designed to blow apart safely if things went wrong, because that was considered an acceptable trade-off for the world that building helped construct. Most of those people left no monument, no named plaque, no entry in the history books most of us ever read. A handful of names survive by accident. A company partner killed alongside his workers, a fire brigade wiped out to the last man, a diary entry from someone who happened to be swimming nearby when a mill blew. The rest are simply gone, absorbed into totals. 228 here, 115 there. Numbers that are precise and also almost entirely anonymous. What these people left behind is quieter than a monument. It's a rock face split open 2 centuries ago that's still standing, a tunnel that still carries trains every single day, a mill that somehow, against every mathematical likelihood given how many of its neighbors eventually exploded, is still standing too, open on weekend afternoons for anyone who wants to walk through it. That's usually how the most consequential engineering stories actually work. Not one dramatic invention that everybody remembers, but centuries of ordinary people quietly managing an extraordinarily dangerous process, refining it a little at a time, and mostly being forgotten the moment something safer came along to replace them. If this kind of forgotten industrial history is the sort of thing you want more of, subscribe. There's a lot more of it out there, most of it hiding in plain sight, in ordinary-looking fields, quiet nature reserves, and museum buildings that almost nobody thinks to visit. This channel exists specifically to go dig those stories up and tell them properly, with real numbers and real names wherever they survive, instead of letting them stay buried in local archives and Heritage Society newsletters. And here's a specific one for the comments. What other overlooked piece of infrastructure or industry deserves this same kind of deep dive? Early dynamite and nitroglycerin factories, Victorian sewer engineering, the first oil refineries, 19th century canal tunneling. Tell us the direction that interests you most, and there's a good chance it ends up as the next video. If this one held your attention for the last several minutes, a like genuinely helps more people find stories like it. And if you made it all the way to the end of a video about explosions nobody talks about anymore, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Thanks for watching.